even more questions. Mr. President, with respect to Puerto Rico, the Obama administration is and has been interested in one thing and one thing only: obtaining the broadest and most comprehensive debt resolution authority for Puerto Rico possible, in an obvious attempt to favor public pensions in Puerto Rico. While I tried last year to work with administration officials toward a resolution for Puerto Rico, Treasury officials remained extraordinarily rigid in their objectives. Moreover, while that administration and many of my friends on the other side have been very forthcoming in offering ideas of how to send roughly $50 billion of extra health funds to Puerto Rico and nearly $10 billion in difficult-to-administer tax incentives, none of them have been forthcoming about the actual cost of their proposals. They have also persisted in identifying what they call, quote, health funding inequities, unquote, but never seem to want to own up to the fact that they purposefully included a cliff in health funding for Puerto Rico as a part of Obamacare. Mr. President, this health funding cliff alone should be a clear indication to the people of Puerto Rico that while the administration and my friends on the other side of the aisle talk one way about how they care for the people of Puerto Rico, they often act quite differently and give far more attention
Falacia.
Por eso hay como una contradicción. Para ver cuál es esa
Pendencia. Bueno, lo voy a decir como es. Lo voy a decir.
That is why I voted to invoke cloture on the legislation before us today, despite the rigidities of the Obama administration and the government of Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, we have been put in a position where if this legislation were to fail, there are with some remarks made yesterday by my colleague and good friend, Senator Cantwell, who correctly identified that whatever happens today with PROMESA issues surrounding Puerto Rico, these issues surrounding Puerto Rico are not going away. I will note that this legislation sets up a congressional task force to consider impediments to growth in Puerto Rico, including those that may stem from the federal government policies. Perhaps Senator Cantwell and I could serve together on the task force. In principle, the task force can allow Congress to continue to address issues surrounding how federal tax and health care policies affect Puerto Rico, and how changes could possibly influence growth. To be clear, I believe that this task force could be useful only if both are willing to seriously discuss ideas beyond sending tens of billions of dollars to Puerto Rico. If the task force will only consider a wish list of federal spending, I don't see it accomplishing all that much for the people living in Puerto Rico. In any event, Mr. President, it is long past time for holding out hope that the government of Puerto Rico will provide accurate financial information. Similarly, it is likely a fruitless endeavor to keep waiting on the Obama administration to move away from its rigid focus on obtaining broad debt restructuring authority for Puerto Rico. We should not hold the people of Puerto Rico hostage to the rigidities of self-interested politicians, neither here nor in the territory. Consequently, I plan to support PROMESA despite its shortcomings. I urge my colleagues to do the same, and I appreciate the honest and decent people in Puerto Rico and wish them the very best and hope that this bill will help them to get on the path that will cause that great and beautiful place to become even better. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
The senator from New Jersey,
I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
without objection.
And Mr. President, I'd ask the presiding officer to advise me when I've used 25 minutes of my time.
The senator will be so notified.
Mr. President, I've come to the floor time and time again on this issue with a simple message. Promesa, which is a Spanish word for promise, is not a promise, it's a power play, leaving the people of Puerto Rico unable to manage their own government, make their own decisions, and do what they believe is necessary for their own future. But in the case of Puerto Rico, we have decided not to help them make their own decisions, but to take the powers of governing away from them. Now, while I have offered many amendments, unfortunately, my colleagues seem to have thrown up their hands and said this bill cannot get any better, that we won't even try to do the people's work and have actual debate and votes in the Senate. And I'd note that calls for a thorough debate on the Senate floor were bipartisan in nature. And I'd remind my colleagues that each one of us was elected to this very chamber to debate and enact legislation to improve the lives of Americans. And that includes the 3.5 million American citizens living in Puerto Rico. Now, I know proponents of the bill have argued supporting an amendment process would force Puerto Rico to default and have serious repercussions for its people. But they're simply mistaken. The truth is, the legislation that we are considering will include a retroactive stay on litigation, meaning that any lawsuit filed before July the 1st will be halted and any judgments unenforceable. As a matter of fact, any lawsuits that take place or any judicial decisions that take place, once the legislation is passed and signed by the president, it will be retroactive to December of last year. So that will be stopped. As the bill states, the stay bars, quote, the commencement or continuation of suits to recover claims against Puerto Rico. It also bars, quote, enforcement of a judgment obtained before the enactment of the bill. In addition, Section 362 of the Bankruptcy Code, which is incorporated by reference into this bill that we are considering, bars the, quote, enforcement of a judgment obtained before filing for bankruptcy, once the board files a bankruptcy petition on Puerto Rico's behalf to restructure their debt. So even if this apocalyptic scenario that the proponents of the bill want to use to drive this bill through, if hedge funds win a judgment before the stay is enacted, that judgment cannot be enforced once the law is passed. And once the debt adjustment plan is confirmed, the judgment can actually be discharged. The Third Circuit Court of Appeals, which has jurisdiction over Puerto Rico, held in 2012, even an injunction is not a claim. Any action to enforce an injunction is subject to the stay and cannot proceed without relief from the stay. What does that basically mean? Any action to enforce is subject to the stay and cannot proceed without relief from the stay. So the stay is the legislation that we're passing. So all of this suggestion that we have to drive into a set of circumstances with a bad bill is not the reality. Now, time is of the essence as it relates to Congress acting swiftly, but we shouldn't allow a somewhat arbitrary deadline to force through a fundamentally flawed bill, as the retroactive stay gives us the time to get it right. July 1st shouldn't be used as an excuse to abdicate our responsibility as United States citizens. Adoption of the motion to table that I will make later can still find a reasonable middle ground to truly help solve the crisis and the humanitarian catastrophe that awaits the people of Puerto Rico, rather than simply ignore their sovereignty and choose the road to colonialism. So while help is getting dim, we still have one last opportunity to do right by the people of Puerto Rico. So I will attempt to table a pending amendment in order to have the opportunity to replace that amendment, if we succeed in going ahead and tabling it, to get a vote on one of my amendments. And while that may seem a little bit confusing as a procedural vote, basically what I'm saying is if you vote for my motion to table, you're giving me an opportunity to have an amendment that I plan to offer in its place. Now, Majority Leader might try to, if we succeed, slip in another amendment, but at the end of the day, we'll know that the whole purpose of tabling is to offer an amendment to improve this legislation. And why must we improve this legislation? Let me go through once again what's wrong with this law. This creates an oversight board. The board, according to the House Natural Resources Committee report, says, so it's not me saying this, it's the official document of the House of Representatives that passed this bill, says the board would have broad sovereign powers. Sovereign powers means as if it has its total authority on its own to effectively overrule decisions by Puerto Rico's legislature, governor, and other public authorities. These are the people who are elected by the 3.5 million citizens of Puerto Rico, United States citizens, to determine their future. But no, the board is going to overrule them and has the sovereign power to do so. Secondly, the oversight board can effectively nullify means end any new laws or policies adopted by Puerto Rico that didn't conform, in their view, to requirements specified in the bill. Nullify a sovereign government's opportunity to pass laws as elected by the people. The consent of the governed is the essence of democracy. Well, we're nullifying that. The control board, as I call it, because I'll speak to why it's control, not oversight, these things speak to controls, not oversight. It says may impose mandatory cuts on Puerto Rico's government and instrumentalities, a power far beyond that exercised by the control board established for the District of Columbia, again from the House Natural Resources report, a power far beyond that which was established for the District of Columbia. So it can say, you know what? Puerto Rico, sorry, we know you put your budget together, we know the legislature passed it, we know the governor signed it, but we think you have to cut in these areas of education, you have to cut in these areas of healthcare, you have to cut in these areas of public safety. They have the power to decide mandatorily that these cuts must take place. And with respect to the government of Puerto Rico and its instrumentalities, which means subdivisions, it can make appropriate reductions in non-debt expenditures. Now, that's very important. So anything that are expenditures to pay the debt, they're held sacrosanct, can't be touched. But non-debt expenditures, this board can say this is where you're going to make the cuts. And what are those non-debt expenditures? It's education and health care and public safety and senior citizens and all the things we think about as a society, protect the people in our society. It has sole discretion over the budget. The board shall determine in its sole discretion, a phrase used nearly 30 times throughout the bill, which means we're not defining what that means. Sole discretion as a common sense. It means they themselves can determine what's appropriate, whether each proposed budget is compliant with the applicable fiscal plan in their sole discretion, even if that discretion is arbitrary and capricious. It has the sole discretion to grant or deny restructuring. Why are we even considering legislation? The whole purpose of our legislation is to give Puerto Rico a pathway to restructuring in the bankruptcy court, where the bankruptcy court under federal laws would take over. But we create a series of problems to that restructuring. The Oversight Board certifies a plan of adjustment only if it determines in its sole discretion that it is consistent with the applicable certified fiscal plan. Again, they could be arbitrary and capricious. And this board that has no representation from Puerto Rico that comes from the Puerto Rican people. It will have one person who either has their primary residence or their primary business in Puerto Rico, but they could have a primary business, not live there, and make dictates about the people of Puerto Rico. And this person doesn't come from the governor and legislature of Puerto Rico representing the Puerto Rican people. This board that has control over their entire life, their budgets, their fiscal plan, the ability to have mandatory cuts, the ability to impose all types, in essence, of what a governing body would do. This oversight board, 7 people, unelected, unaccountable. Guess who pays for them? Puerto Rico pays. Within 30 days after the date of enactment, the territorial government shall designate a dedicated funding source, meaning a source only to pay for this, not subject to legislative appropriations. And guess how much the estimate of that is? This is the Congressional Budget Office. It says Puerto Rico's going to have to pay about $370 million for this control board. Here's an island that doesn't have the money to meet some of the basic necessities that we've heard so eloquently talked about on both sides of the aisle, but we're going to impose another $370 million on them, at least, as is estimated by the Congressional Budget Office, for a control board that they have no say over. And they have no oversight over the control board. Neither the governor nor the legislature can exercise any control, supervision, oversight, but they get to pay the $370 million, and they have to live with all the dictates of the control board, even though they don't have representation. And to further make sure that the control board is even more omnipotent, they put in a no liability clause. The oversight board, its members, and its employees shall not be liable for any obligation of or any claim against the oversight board or its members or employees or the territorial government resulting from actions taken to carry out this act. So they have absolute immunity. Wow. Wouldn't we all like to have that? So my amendment is targeted to improve the most egregious flaws of this legislation. My amendment would ensure that the people of Puerto Rico have a voice in their future. The current legislation denies the Puerto Rican people any representation on a board that effectively replaces the decision-making powers of the legislative and executive branches of their democratically elected government. And it imposes on the board on Puerto Rico without ever consulting the people of Puerto Rico. My amendment makes 2 critical changes to protect Puerto Rico's sovereignty and democratic rights. Under my amendment, if we got to it through the motion to table, Puerto Rico would decide for itself whether it will access restructuring and accept a control board, thus preserving the people's voice in the process. Second, my amendment adds 2 additional voting members to the board, chosen by the elected representatives of the people of Puerto Rico. These 2 additional members would be chosen by the president from a list of 4 candidates submitted by the governor of Puerto Rico with the advice and consent of the legislature of Puerto Rico. Republicans will still appoint the majority of members from an ideological perspective. Now, I personally believe that all the members of the board should be chosen by the people of Puerto Rico or their elected representatives. But I want to be reasonable and open to compromise, which is why my amendment only requires 2 members of a 9-member board to be chosen by Puerto Rico. Certainly, we can all agree that the people who will have to deal with all of the consequences of this board's decision should have some say as to who is making the decisions. My amendment would also protect senior citizens and avoid an increase in elderly poverty. Promesa currently includes a vague and undefined requirement to provide adequate funding for public pension systems. Our amendment would ensure that senior retirees and pensioners are protected from the whims of the control board. After all, retirees in Puerto Rico who spent 30 years serving the island as police officers, firefighters, teachers, and nurses, they didn't have any choice but to participate in the pension plan. It was mandatory. Unlike hedge funds who were able to pick and choose what investments to make and often bought bonds at pennies on the dollar, public servants had to participate in the pension system. They had no way of knowing that their nest egg, which they worked their entire lives for, was at risk of being taken away. They didn't contribute to the fiscal problems facing Puerto Rico. They didn't borrow too much or fail to make annual contributions to the funds. So why should they lose their retirement funds? Besides the fundamental flaws with the control board and failure to provide critical protections for seniors and retirees, this bill also fails to provide a clear pathway to restructuring, which is the whole purpose of this legislation and this debate to begin with. The unelected control board created in this bill will have the ultimate authority to decide whether Puerto Rico's debts are even worthy of restructuring. So let's not fool ourselves in believing that it's a sure thing that this bill guarantees the island the ability to restructure its debts. Indeed, Section 206 of the bill lists 4 gatekeeping requirements before any restructuring can occur. It must have engaged in good faith efforts to reach a consensual agreement with creditors. It must establish a system to develop and make public, timely, audited financial reports. It must adopt a fiscal plan approved by the board. But even if Puerto Rico meets and fulfills these requirements, there is still an additional, even higher hurdle it must hurdle in order to access restructuring. Instead, the 4th gatekeeping requirement in the Promesa legislation requires a supermajority of 5-2 vote by the control board in order for any of the island's debts to be restructured. That means when you call for a supermajority, it means a minority of that 7, 3 people, ideologically may be opposed to the concept of restructuring or allowing Puerto Rico to get access to the bankruptcy court, could derail the island's attempts to achieve sustainable debt payments. And without any authority to restructure its debt, all this legislation will do is take away the democratic rights of 3.5 million Americans and leave the future to wishful thinking and a prayer that the crisis will somehow be resolved. Instead of leaving this critical decision up to the whims of a minority of the board, my amendment would provide a clear path to restructuring by removing this arbitrary vote requirement. Instead, under my amendment, the government or instrumentality would be able to restructure its debts once it completed the first 3 gatekeeping requirements. When the main purpose of this bill is to give Puerto Rico the tools to restructure all of its debts, why would we leave this authority to chance? In addition to the undemocratic control board and obfuscated path to restructuring, I have serious concerns that the bill would actually increase poverty and out-migration rather than stemming both. That's because it provides an exception to the federal minimum wage for younger workers, and it exempts the island from recently finalized overtime protections. At a time when we're seeking to increase workers' wages, Promesa goes in the opposite direction and actually cuts them. It amazes me that the solution to get Puerto Rico's economy growing again is to ensure that workers make even less money. No, lowering people's wages is not a pro-growth strategy. It's a pro-migration strategy. Because anyone who lives on the island of Puerto Rico, a United States citizen, takes a JetBlue flight to the United States, has the overtime protections, has the minimum wage protections. If they're a senior, have full Medicare protections. If they're indigent, have full Medicaid protections, have just about everything any other United States citizen would have. So all these provisions would do is intensify out-migration to the mainland, where Puerto Ricans are eligible for everything I just discussed. This is why my amendment strips these offensive and unrelated riders out of this bill, so that I would urge my colleagues to support these common sense improvements to the bill by voting for my motion to table. Now, I've known for the past several weeks, well, maybe months since I started coming to the floor in September of last year, and then urgently several times in December of last year to say now is the time to act so we're not up against an emergent situation. But no, I guess the 3.5 million citizens of Puerto Rico did not deserve the type of attention and urgency that we should have given to them as members of Congress. I've understood that for that period of time, the deck was stacked against the people of Puerto Rico. But I'm not ready to give up just yet. Put simply, Promesa exacts a price far too high for relief that is far too uncertain. If we throw up our hands in the air and refuse to make changes to this wholly inferior bill, which we can protect by the retroactive nature that we have already put in the legislation to stay any judgments, we will cast a dark shadow on the future of Puerto Rico. A vote against tabling my motion, against tabling the pending amendment, is a vote to disenfranchise 3.5 million Americans. It's a vote to authorize an unelected and all-powerful control board that could close schools, shutter hospitals, cut senior citizen pensions to the bone. A vote to force Puerto Rico, without their say, to go $370 million further in debt to pay for this omnipotent control board, which they don't even want. A vote to cut the minimum wage down to $4.25 per hour for younger workers in Puerto Rico. A vote to make Puerto Ricans work long overtime hours without fair compensation or protection. A vote to jeopardize collective bargaining agreements. A vote to cut worker benefits and privatize inherently government functions. A vote to place well-heeled hedge funds and creditors ahead of the people. A vote to give the board the power to sell off and commercialize natural treasures that belong to the people of Puerto Rico. And at its worst, it's a vote to authorize an unelected, unchecked, and all-powerful control board to determine Puerto Rico's destiny for a generation or more. And let's be clear, the people of Puerto Rico find this board to be offensive and disrespectful. In fact, according to a recent poll commissioned by Puerto Rico's largest newspaper, El Nuevo Día, 69% of all respondents opposed, 69% opposed the Promesa bill, the bill that we're voting on today, while 54% opposed the very idea of an oversight board. And their concerns are validated by the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, which, as I said earlier, says that the board has broad sovereign powers to effectively overrule decisions by Puerto Rico's legislature, governor, and other public authorities. It can nullify any new laws or policies adopted by Puerto Rico that did not conform to requirements specified in the bill. Even the bill's own author noted in the committee report, the board may impose mandatory cuts on Puerto Rico's government and instrumentalities in its sole discretion, as the bill cites 29 times, using the superpowers in this bill to make mandatory budget cuts that harm the people of Puerto Rico, but there is nothing anybody from Puerto Rico can do about it. And these powers aren't limited to just budget and fiscal policy. The bill states in Section 205, the Control Board can submit recommendations to the governor on a wide range of issues, including how Puerto Rico organizes its government, how they meet pension obligations, what services the government delivers, how they determine labor and wage performance standards, how Puerto Rico's laws affect the government, and perhaps most egregiously, the Control Board can submit recommendations on the privatization and commercialization of entities within the government itself. And while this section calls these comments recommendations, another section allows the board to, quote, adopt appropriate recommendations submitted by the Oversight Board under Section 205. So in essence, they can adopt the very essence of what they say is a recommendation. So the board can decide to hold a fire sale and put Puerto Rican natural wonders on the auction block to the highest bidder. Is that what the people of Puerto Rico want? Is that what we want? The fact is, Mr. President, this legislation puts balanced budgets and untested ideology ahead of the health, safety, and well-being of children and families, similar to how the Control Board travesty unfolded in Flint. Without their voices represented on the Control Board, there is nothing the people of Puerto Rico will be able to do. The fact that the Puerto Rican people will have absolutely no say over who is appointed or what action they decide is clearly blatant neocolonialism. I'm afraid we're opening the floodgates for Puerto Rico to become a laboratory for right-wing economic policies. Puerto Rico deserves much more than to be the unwilling host of untested experiments in austerity. Now, I'm not advocating to completely remove all oversight powers. To the contrary, I support helping Puerto Rico make informed, prudent decisions that put it on a path to economic growth and solvency. But despite its name, the Oversight Board envisioned by this bill doesn't simply oversee, it directs, it commands, it controls. The Control Board has final say on the fiscal plan, final say on the budget, veto laws, contracts, rules, regulations, executive orders, can even mandate across-the-board budget cuts with no regard to the impact on the people. So mark my words, if we don't seize this opportunity to address this crisis in a meaningful way, we will be right back here in a year from now picking up the pieces. So while it's absolutely clear that we need to act and act decisively and expediently.
The senators consume 25 minutes and
I thank the chair. So while it's absolutely clear that we need to act and act decisively and expediently to help our fellow citizens, United States citizens in Puerto Rico, just as importantly, we need to get it right. Working together and helping each other in a time of need is what this country is all about. When a hurricane hits the Gulf Coast or a tornado ravages the Midwest, or when we've seen wildfires in the West, or we see what happened in West Virginia, I don't stand here and ask how my constituents in New Jersey were affected. Rather, I stand with my fellow Americans and fight to provide relief regardless of what state or territory they are from. So it seems to me there's a reason we call this country the United States of America. And United States citizens who enjoy the privilege of calling America home. The 3.5 million United States citizens of Puerto Rico are also part of that great American people. As I have outlined, I have an amendment to make reasonable and targeted improvements to this legislation so that workers can get the retirement they deserve. The people of Puerto Rico are protected from egregious attacks on their pay. The island has unimpeded access to restructure its debt. And most importantly, that the people of Puerto Rico have a say in their future, the consent of the governed, the very essence of what democracy is all about. So, Mr. President, I move to table the motion to concur with amendment number 4865, and I ask for the yeas and nays on my motion.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The yeas and nays are ordered.
Mr. President, with that, I reserve the balance of my time, and I yield the floor.
President,
Senator from North Dakota.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that Kelsey Bowe, an intern in my office, be granted floor privileges during the duration of today's session in the Senate.
Without objection.
I also ask unanimous consent to display a replica of a wheel loader that is produced in North Dakota.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. It may seem like an odd request, but it actually has a purpose because it reflects literally hundreds of jobs in my state and really hundreds of jobs across the country. June 30th will be an anniversary that is really not worthy of celebration. That is that it's an anniversary of when we literally shut down the Export-Import Bank and made it unable to function for the first time in its 80-year history. Now, that may not seem like a lot. It may not seem like it's something that we should be very, very concerned about, but I can tell you that workers across our country, workers who work in manufacturing, individuals whose livelihood depends on exports from our country, know the impact today of this action or inaction. So despite the fact that Congress reauthorized the agency 6 months ago, the EXIM Bank has been hamstrung from supporting American jobs and businesses because there isn't a quorum on the EXIM Bank. For decades, the Export-Import Bank has helped level the playing field for American businesses and American workers. And it's past time for politics to stop dictating whether, in fact, the bank can do its job. The current nominee to the EXIM Bank Board, the nominee that would, in fact, provide a quorum, was nominated not by a liberal Democrat, not by the president, but instead was the Republican nominee to the EXIM Bank Board. His name is Mark McWaters. His nomination is currently pending in the Senate Banking Committee. And the Senate Banking Committee chairman has told us in no uncertain terms he will not bring up the McWaters vote in the committee because of his own personal opposition to the EXIM Bank. Again, despite the fact that 64 Republican and Democratic senators, along with 70% of the people in of the representatives in the House of Representatives, voted last year to reauthorize the EXIM Bank. If we do not take this step, if we do not, in fact, get the bank up and running, we will continue to do what we've been talking about, which is pink slipping the American manufacturing workers. So we're here today to recommend that this body take action so that no more workers, no more manufacturing, hardworking Americans are prevented from doing their job and are given pink slips and laid off. So when you looked at where we were last year and the challenges that we had a whole-out debate. And a lot of people say there wasn't a debate on this, we didn't get a chance to air our grievances. That is strictly nonsense. We fought this issue very hard, had many, many floor debates, many, many floor discussions about this, and at the end of the day, the vast majority of this body voted to reauthorize and put the EXIM Bank back to work. So why are we in the spot that we are today? Because we cannot do any credit over $10 million without approval of a bank board. Cannot be done unilaterally. And as a result, many, many credits, in fact, $2 billion worth of activity is pending in the pipeline at the EXIM Bank. So when you look at many of the big companies across this country, a lot of times people will say, well, that's just about this company or that company, fill in whatever big name corporation you want to. But the bottom line is, this isn't just about those companies. It's about a supply chain that goes all the way down to states as small as North Dakota. And so if you look at Boeing, for instance, and you look at what the impact is on Boeing and what that means for our producers. When Boeing currently has 16 suppliers in North Dakota, which will lose out, not just could lose out, but will lose out if Boeing doesn't get enough support from the EXIM Bank to sustain its operations and to continue to produce its planes with American workers. Today, I bring this a wheel loader to the floor of the Senate. And I do that because this demonstrates the effect that this lack of activity on this nomination will have on Case New Holland in my state. Case New Holland has a dealer in New Jersey called Hoffman Equipments that has secured a $80 million deal with the country of Cameroon. The only way Cameroon can afford this deal is if they use EXIM financing. If the deal doesn't go through, facilities in 3 states will lose. So who are those? Take today North Dakota, where we produce these wheel loaders in Fargo. You know, the great irony of this is, as we have been challenged with our agricultural economy and ag manufacturing, guess what? Ag manufacturing is down, in part because we stimulated a lot of purchases back when the economy was good in farm country. But I will tell you that 70 people just in the last couple weeks have been laid off at Case in Fargo. Think of what's going to happen if we lose this sale. Think of what will happen to workers in Iowa if they lose the sale for the backhoes that are produced in Iowa by Case. Think about what's going to happen in Kansas if we lose the skid steer portion of that Cameroon sale. I will tell you, every day we are losing jobs because of the inability for the EXIM Bank to do its job in promoting and guaranteeing that American manufactured products find their way into the global marketplace. GE announced in June that it will receive financing from the French Export Credit Agency to support exports that will be made in France now rather than the United States. And so the French Credit Export Agency will be providing an additional line of credit for gas turbines that will be produced not in the United States, but will be produced in France and exported to countries such as Saudi Arabia, Mexico, and Brazil. As a result, GE will invest $40 million in the French economy instead of investing $40 million in the American economy. You know what that means? That means when you look at these jobs, just translate $40 million, and we recognize a lot of that is input costs. But one of the major input costs in all of this is American workers. How can we stand by and let this happen? How can we stand by and not fight for these jobs for American manufacturers? There is no way we can come to the floor and say we're for the American worker and not be for the Export-Import Bank. No way can we come to the floor and say we're for competition, global competition, that will put the best products into the marketplace, which are American products, and not move the bank forward. And so I'm going to yield to my friend from the state of Washington, or yield to my friend from the great state of Iowa.
Mr. President, I wanted to ask the senator from North Dakota a question, if I could. I see she's been out here with an actual display. You know, it's quite amazing that we have to go to this level to bring up an issue about jobs in our economy. But I admire the dedication of the senator from North Dakota to saying how important it is, because we're about to go home for another summer recess here in a few weeks. And everybody thought last year we were passing legislation that was going to secure America's place in a global economy by making sure that products we make could be sold in overseas markets. So the secret is, though, that there are now 30 transactions worth more than $20 billion that aren't getting done simply because one senator refuses to let a nominee out of a committee. So one senator is holding up the sale of that replica of a product that you have on your desk. They're holding up the sale of airplanes. They're holding up the sale of other products, all because they don't want to have a functioning board. So we're here to ask our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to help us break this logjam so that we can sell export products. But I was curious to ask the senator from North Dakota, because you were mentioning how these transactions are happening now. That is, that people are deciding to move. I think I just, for the record, want to submit a New York Times article that was called "A Single Senator Stymies the Export-Import Bank." And in it, it talks about 2 weeks ago, GE making an announcement they were going to expand manufacturing in France rather than South Carolina, and how they were investing in the Czech Republic instead of in Texas, and that jobs in South Carolina, Maine, and New York were also getting transferred to other countries. So the whole point of the Export Credit Agency is to give U.S. manufacturers the credit. So my point is, your products are agriculture-based, and yet people, I think that they can get done, yet they're not getting done because they are a growing world. So if you could explain to me, these aren't manufacturing products here, they aren't agriculture manufacturing product, but you're saying, I guess, with your display, that we're now starting to see large-scale U.S. manufacturing products out of agriculture that also are not getting credit financing.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we do not move with haste, if we do not supply on time, we won't get
The senator from North
business.
Dakota's time has expired.
Mr. President, do I have time reserved in the consent agreement?
The senator from Washington has 10 minutes in the
Well, I
agreement.
yield whatever time for our discussion to continue of that 10 minutes.
The senator from North Dakota.
Yeah. Why I think it's absolutely critically important to make this point, not just about what we produce, but who produces it, is because at the end of the day, 95% of all potential consumers in America do not live in this country. And America still remains the best and most treasured producer of quality equipment, construction equipment in the world. These are jobs that have helped my manufacturing sector that is dependent on agriculture, which has huge challenges right now. So if you can't produce tractors that farmers are going to buy, we can produce construction equipment that everyone can buy to build infrastructure in their countries. And so a narrow view even in this Congress, 67 senators voted to open up the Export-Import Bank. Over 70% of the House of Representatives said, this is nonsense, let's open up the Export-Import Bank. But yet we're unable to do it because credits over $10 million cannot be moved forward without the approval of a bank board, and a bank board can't operate without a quorum. That's the bottom line.
Mr. President, if I could ask the senator from North Dakota just one more question, because I know I want to make sure she continues to make her points, and I know we have a colleague that's also waiting, but aren't we here right now today to ask our colleagues that when we come back after July 4th, that we have 2 weeks, let's dedicate ourselves. It's not every day the United States Senate can be involved in an activity that actually creates so much economic value, $20 billion in job creation, but we could get that done. So we're here asking our colleagues to step up and help us resolve this issue in whatever way possible. You don't want to let a nominee out of committee because you made a promise to somebody. Fine, let's put language somewhere in a product that's moving. We can look at the FAA bill, we can look at anything. But to go home for the recess all the way through these August months, leaving those farmers without the economic closure to a deal that's been inked, a sale that's been made, to jobs that have been created, all because you won't let somebody have an operating majority on a board, seems like a very drastic step. So is that why you're here, to ask our colleagues to step up to the plate and help us resolve this before the July 15th recess?
Thank you, Senator Cantwell. That's exactly why I'm here, but I'm also here to ask our colleagues to be empathetic, to actually think about what that would feel like if you were employed in a gas turbine a business in one of the Carolinas, and that business went to went to France because we couldn't figure out how to open up the bank? How would you feel? And that's why I think it's so important to not reflect just on our trade deficit and just on the imperative of building our manufacturing base and our export base, which, if that's not enough economic argument for you, let's look at the micro argument. Let's look at what's happening to American families because we aren't getting our job done here. And so I've said it before.
And collect revenues while reducing expenses within the government. The second principle, it would be a bad idea for Congress to permit Puerto Rico to walk away from its constitutional debt obligations through what some call an unprecedented super Chapter 9 bankruptcy. I received a letter